Okay, let's get started. Hello everyone, my name's Yvette and I work for Look Ahead, which are part of KIDAS. I want to welcome everyone to this final event today. I'll be moderating the session. This closing event is part of the 16 days of action to end gender-based violence. Kent Integrated Domestic Abuse Services have had 16 events running between the 25th of November to today to inform, educate and inspire action so that we can make domestic abuse everybody's business, because domestic abuse is everybody's business and everyone can make a difference, which is what you're doing by attending this conference. We have 3 amazing speakers today, and during the event you are able to use the Q&A text box on your screen to ask our first speaker, Gemma, any questions you have. I'll then publish these and ask them at the end of the session. Gemma will be speaking for approximately 20 minutes and we will then have 15 minutes for questions. Just to note that your email confirmations show the webinar is slightly longer so we don't get cut off the system. You can use the thumbs up underneath the question to upvote it if it's something you'd like to ask too. And if you'd like to ask a follow-up question, please preface with the words follow-up. If you need any help or support or have been affected by anything you hear today, please call the number that's now on your screen. You can X out of it when you've got the number. So that just leaves me with the wonderful job of introducing Gemma Evans. Gemma is an inspirational speaker, self-love and confidence coach to women around the globe. Having seen her dad try to commit suicide at the age of 10, she very quickly learned how harsh life could be. That continued into her 20s when, after the birth of her second baby, Gemma suffered a breakdown. This resulted in her marriage breakdown, and not long afterwards she found herself in another relationship, which was both cohesively and mentally abusive. The perpetrator tried to take Gemma's life and then, after months of abuse, took his own. Gemma now supports women who are in abusive relationships and teaches them simple yet effective steps which have seen her go from victim to survivor and from survivor to thriving. Gemma will tell her story and share these steps with you today and answer any questions openly or privately afterwards. Okay, over to you, Gemma.
Thank you so much, Yvette. So thank you so much, everybody, for having me here today. So Yvette's told you a little bit about me, and I would just like to share a little bit more. So first of all, as Yvette said, I'm an inspirational speaker and I support women who are already in or who have been in a domestically abusive relationship. That was not something that I planned to do when I left school. It was never an inspiration of mine. If I'm honest with you, I did not even know what domestic abuse was. I had no idea of it. And that takes me to the beginning of my story, which was when I was 10-year-old. And one of my very, very first memories of being at a very young age was my mum waking me up during the middle of the night, and my dad had tried to commit suicide. He took an overdose of prescription medicine and alcohol, and my mum didn't really know what to do at the time, so she woke me out of bed for a little bit of support to just love and care for him and try to keep him conscious. At the time, it was 27 years ago, so at the time we didn't have a house phone. There was no such thing as mobile phones. And that was the beginning of my domestic abuse story, and also my mental illness story as well. I didn't know back then, but my dad used to mentally abuse my mum. I absolutely had no idea. I grew up in the environment and I just thought that was normal. And it wasn't until years later that I realised that I was the victim as a child of a domestically abusive relationship. And as Yvette said in the introduction, that has impacted my life massively. And I left my career as I was in the pub trade. I was a manager for a huge company, and I left my career and decided to go self-employed and support women around the globe. And now I travel around the world speaking, inspirationally speaking. And it's not so much my story that is most important here today, but it's how I got over it and the tools and the things that I did to actually go from being that victim into a survivor, and then from a survivor to who I am now. And that was down to the people that helped me and a lot of self-help from myself. So going back to my childhood, my dad did commit suicide. He killed himself when I was 17-year-old. and that impacted me massively. I then got married at the age of 21, had 2 little boys, and a month after I had my second baby, I suffered a nervous breakdown that resulted in my marriage ending, and I became a single parent. At no point up to this stage of my life did I think that I was ever the victim, the child victim of mental abuse, and I actually had no idea what it was. I thought that domestic abuse was actually violence. I thought that domestic abuse was a hit, a punch, or a slap. I had absolutely no idea that there was such things as mental, emotional, coercive. And it was back in 2012, and it was August 2012. I went out on a date with a man who I knew from my local pub. We had mutual friends, and that relationship very quickly got serious. Even just on the first date, some of the things that he said to me, I now recognise as red flags. And if you know a little bit about domestic abuse, or you are anywhere involved with domestic abuse, you'll know that red flags are just things that a normal person would actually probably shrug off the shoulder. They wouldn't really think that that was something that was worth flagging. But I now know that a red flag is, if you hear a red flag, and we need to make, and I make red flags something that I post about red flags all the time, because it can just be a comment, it can just be a movement or anything like that. So I recognise from a very, very, very early stage, in my relationship, that a red flag, and I only know that now because I know what red flags are. So that, as I said, the relationship moved very, very quickly, very serious, and within 6 months, I found myself financially bankrupt. I'd rehomed my 2 dogs. I'd gave my car back to the finance company. I'd gave my house back to my ex-husband. I'd gave my timeshare, my villa in Spain, back to my ex-husband. I didn't work because I'd lost my business, and I was reliant on this gentleman who I met in the pub, whom I thought at the time loved me. Bearing in mind, at this point, there was actually no hands raised. I'd never received a hit, a punch, or a slap. I'd never received a mark, any form on my skin. And the first time that he did raise his hands to me was about 7 months into the relationship. And that was when I actually triggered and thought, I am now in an abusive relationship. At the time, I lived in an authority. My local authority wasn't at the time very helpful to me, and I reported it. They didn't really act on it. And again, because of that reason, I shrugged it under the mat. And, I did move out. I did get my own house. And very quickly, the mental games started again. I'd been into my new house for 6 weeks. I woke up one morning and there was videos and messages on my phone. And my perpetrator was actually slitting his wrists, videoing himself, telling me that because I'd left him, that was my fault that he was doing that. As you can imagine, seeing somebody try to commit suicide, I went straight back to being that little girl, that 10-year-old girl who was watching her dad try to kill himself. I got no support from my local authority at all. I did call them, and I called an ambulance. I called the police and said, you need to get to his house now, because it was 2 hours ago. I don't know if he's alive or if he's dead. And they got there. I wasn't even given a telephone call afterwards to check how I was, or to say, this is what they had the records on the phone of me moving out, of him raising his hands to me, and there was no follow-up. And I do believe that if I'd have been given earlier on support, that maybe I wouldn't have went back to that relationship. Unfortunately, I did return to that relationship, and things went from bad to worse. Every time we had an argument, every time I cooked something that wasn't to his liking, there would be plates flung across the room. I would have drinks poured over my head. He would threaten to kill himself twice. Again, he tried to kill himself. And, I couldn't save my dad. And as a little girl, turned into a woman, I was witnessing this all over again. And I tried so hard to save my perpetrator from himself. I called the police numerous occasions. They came, they removed him or removed me, and nothing. I was given no support from any domestic abuse charities or organisations. And it was in December 2012 that we decided that we would have a fresh start, and we moved not very far down the road, only 8 miles down the road, but far enough to change authorities. And on the Boxing Day of 2012, my perpetrator returned after a night out. He tried to strangle me, and the neighbours heard me screaming, and they called the police. The police came, and they seen the ligature marks around my neck. They removed him, and basically he tried to dismiss it as we just had a domestic. Basically, we've had an argument, and the police officer like pointed out, you know, she has marks around her neck, so we are going to remove you from the scene. And it was 2 days later that I actually got a knock at the door from a local authority, women's support organisation, which is called Harbour. And that was when after I'd spoke to that lady, that was the first time that I actually realised that I had been in a domestically abusive relationship from the very beginning. And she helped me realise. Again, I was in denial a lot. Coercive control means that you are battling inside of your own head. You were trying to make sense of what is being said to you, what is being done to you. And at that point, I did only accept that he had actually raised his hands to me twice. Yes, he'd poured drinks over my head. Yes, he'd flung plates across the room full of food. Yes, he'd broke doors, but he'd only actually raised his hands actually to me twice. And it was that organisation that helped me to realise that coercive control was real, mental abuse was real, and that you don't have to walk away with a hit, a punch, or a slap to be in a domestically abusive relationship. And that's when I realised that I actually was also the victim of an abusive relationship. But as a child, I'd listened to my dad say things to my mum. I'd watched her walk on eggshells. And, you know, I didn't want that for my children. However, I was in far too deep to actually just be able to walk away from that abusive relationship. My perpetrator got bailed after the event on after Boxing Day, and he would turn up at my house. He would be scruffy. He would have not slept. He wouldn't have washed. He was sleeping in his car. He was actually bailed to his parents' house, and he didn't want to be there. He wanted to be with me. I now understand that, because if he had control over me, he still had power. Domestic abuse is only about power and control. It's not about love. And when they have control over you, they keep the power. And that control, whether it be financial, sexual, whether it be for children, most perpetrators will keep a hold of their children just to keep control over their partner or ex-partner. I had alarms fitted to my house, panic alarms. I had mesh put on my windows. I had a cage put across my letterbox. The police would drive by and, you know, make sure, and as much as they could, that I was safe. But I still managed to get him inside of my house, and I still managed to save this man because I couldn't save my own dad. On the 17th of February 2013, my perpetrator tried to cut my throat. He had me pinned to the kitchen floor. He was trying to cut my throat. He was hitting me with a knife. He was spitting at me. And this was all because he was jealous, because I'd actually flicked my hair whilst we'd been out shopping. And he thought I was flirting with other guys in the supermarket, in Asda supermarket. He mentioned my children, and I found the strength to actually push him off. And I tried to grab my panic alarm, which I knew was hanging on my living room door, and it wasn't there. He'd moved it. He knew exactly what he was going to do on that night to me. It was all premeditated. He knew, and he'd hid the panic alarm. I knew that I had a panic alarm underneath my bed, and I literally just ran up the stairs of my house, and I got underneath my bed and pressed the panic alarm. And I could hear his footsteps coming up the stairs, and the police officers after Boxing Day had told me that they'd reached my house within 6 minutes, because they had no idea if they was coming to a domestic, to a murder scene. They didn't know. And the thoughts that were going through my head was, right now, I don't know what these police are going to come to. And all the while I could hear his footsteps coming up the stairs. Literally, as he got to the bedroom door, the control room voiced on my panic alarm, and they said, Gemma, we're on our way and we will be there as soon as we possibly can. Please try to stay safe. He heard that, and his very last words to me was, you bitch, they will put me away for this. He left my house that evening, and on his way out, he took my mobile phone. He then went into hiding. He texted all of his family pretending to be me, and saying that he was going to kill himself again, and that I hoped that he did it. They obviously at the time didn't know that it wasn't me, and they didn't know it was him. The police put me into protection. They searched my house. They was in my loft. They was in my garden shed, everywhere. And he basically told the police that he was coming back for me that night, and he was going to take me with him, and he was going to kill me. Early hours of the next morning, I learned that he had actually killed himself, which he'd threatened to do so many times. And he was found in a house that he was working on for a local building company. He was a joiner. He had access to these houses. They had skeleton keys. They could just enter the houses as they wished. And it wasn't the police that actually came and told me that he'd killed himself. I learned from social media that my partner, my perpetrator, was dead. And it wasn't until 1 o'clock that afternoon that a policeman knocked on my door to tell me that he'd killed himself. And by that point, I obviously already knew. I then was given so much help by domestic abuse charities and authorities, organisations in my area, that I am absolutely indebted to them for the rest of my life. I'm forever grateful. Had it not been for these organisations, I would have not been where I am today and not been able to stand up and tell my story. They showed me, they put me on a programme called the Freedom Programme, which helped me so much believe that actually I was the victim of coercive control. At the time, coercive control wasn't illegal, and it's still sometimes really hard for me to make sense that I was in a domestically abusive relationship. I had this picture in my head of somebody who would be a victim of domestic abuse, and I didn't see that that person was me. I was a successful business lady. I owned my own home. You know, I had a nice car, and that just didn't fit right for me. So it took a lot of understanding and acceptance. And one of the main things I say when I stand up on stage now and tell my story is it could happen to any single person. Just because somebody doesn't fit the protocol of what you think is a victim of domestic abuse, it doesn't mean to say that they are not a victim. So now I teach women how to learn about self-love. We can take women out of abusive relationships and keep them safe, but they are not going to stay out of that abusive relationship because they have been knocked down so hard. They have been told that they are worthless. They have been told that they are ugly, that they amount to nothing. They have been broken down bit by bit. And one thing that I will point out is that you do not meet a perpetrator on a first date and he tells you what he's going to do to you. He does it ever so slight, ever so small little digs here and there, and he will eventually knock you down till you actually don't know the person who you are anymore. And that's what I do now. I teach women that you can go from being a victim to a survivor, but if you don't have the love for yourself and if you haven't regained that confidence, you will slowly but surely slip back into a victim mode, because perpetrators know who they're looking for. They have a certain type of person who they are looking for, whether that be a man or a woman. They know exactly what they want, and they are good at what they do. This is not something a perpetrator doesn't just act ad hoc. They do not just think, this is what I'm going to do now. They have it all planned in their head. They know exactly what they want to do. So like I said, I teach women now to take control, total control of their lives, to be confident in all areas of their lives, to be confident in their physical appearance, in the mental appearance, in the home life, in the work, in in everything that they do, in their diet, in their nutrition. And I pride myself on that. However, one thing that I will say is, without the charities that helped me, or women's organisations, I definitely wouldn't be where I am today. And that brings me to an end to say that I would absolutely love, across the nation, across the world, for police and other organisations who quite possibly would be there on front hand, to be walking into a scene, to know about coercive control, to know about domestic abuse. And I do believe that if that was the case, that we could help a lot more women a lot faster. Thank you so much for listening to me. That I did only talk for 20 minutes, so that is my story in a small nutshell. I could have talked for 2 hours. There was so much to tell you, but that was the main events. But if you take anything away from me today, it is that domestic abuse will happen to anybody, and it happens to 1 in 3 women. And it could be a woman who's sat right next to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gemma. That was really, really inspirational, and what a difficult story to listen to. Thank you so much for sharing it. We've got a few questions coming in. Please keep your questions coming. Question from Melanie Smith. Please tell me what your red flags are initially. It's small little signs.
Yeah, so initially, Melanie, thanks very much for that question. Initially, my red flags were, he commented on how well liked I was in our local community. He said nobody has, his basic words were, nobody has a bad word for you. You were so well liked. And I just laughed. I thought that was a compliment, but now I actually seen that that was getting in the way of his power over me, his control over me. Because what a perpetrator does is they don't only tear you down bit by bit, they will make people in the local community who once loved you, who once liked you, they will slowly but surely turn those people against you. And, you know, they will tell them that you've done things and that you've said things or you've seen things. And these people will obviously question, because why would they not? The perpetrator puts the mask on when he walks out. My perpetrator was so charismatic. He was so charming. Everybody absolutely idolized him. But it was when he got back in the house and he took his mask off that I seen the real monster that he was. Even just that initial comment of everybody loves you. Why does everybody love you? Why does everybody like you? He's seen that as a massive threat. And I now know that for me, that was a red flag.
Thank you. Question from Polly. How do we discuss with children or bring it up that they are a victim of domestically abusive relationships? Are there any resources?
Polly, thank you so much for that question. It is, I didn't know I was a child victim of domestic abuse because it's what I thought was normal. I had no idea that other children in my school didn't hear or see that. So it is just making children aware that if they are uncomfortable with something, if one of their parents says something to the other parent that makes them feel uncomfortable, you know, it could be, most perpetrators will also turn the children against their mum, and they will encourage, one parent will encourage the other parent to actually say nasty things. In my case, although my perpetrator wasn't the father of my children, he used to encourage my children, if I was eating, he would say, Mummy's eating, she's going to get fat, tell her she's going to get fat. And then that would subconsciously get inside my head. And, you know, my children shouldn't be looking at me thinking, oh, Mummy's eating, she's going to get fat. They should just look at me and think, that's my mummy and I love her and I love them. So the perpetrator will do small things to actually have digs through the children directly at the victim. It is literally just talking to children, and if there is anything that they feel uncomfortable with, but it is so hard because a child might not feel uncomfortable if it's something that they think's normal.
Absolutely. Thank you. Question from Margaret. What profile of a person is an abuser likely to seek out?
Well, I personally thought that it was a weak victim. A victim would be weak and, you know, an easy target. And there is no such profile. They just look for a woman who they know that they can break down. So whether it be that they've got a good a good community figure about them, it might be whether they're a good parent. So there isn't an actual profile that suits a victim, but a perpetrator will know exactly when he looks at a victim what exactly he wants to change about her. And in my case, sadly, it was that I was a successful businesswoman and he had such a low opinion of women. He actually thought that I'd only managed to get so far, so high up in my career because I'd actually slept my way there.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question from Rachel. Have your children been offered support to understand and deal with their experiences?
No, never, not once. I was really in denial that it actually affected my children. And it wasn't until I did the effects on children, the 2 episodes with the Freedom Programme, that I actually realised that my children didn't have to see it. They didn't have to be in the same room or even in the room next door, that they would just know by how I acted as a person. I was on edge, I walked on eggshells, and they was never offered any help or support. Luckily, I've rebuilt myself up, and through everything that I do, I now speak to them and make sure that it didn't affect them. Who's to say that it hasn't affected them? It possibly might have affected them in the future. But no, there has been no outside support from any authority or any organisation to support the two boys.
That's sad. That's a shame. Okay. Question from Hina. Gemma, what's the first step of healing, please?
The first step of healing is to actually accept that it's happened. I was in denial for so long because I didn't think it could happen to me. Is to actually accept that it's happened, but also accept that you're not still in that place. I'm so thankful for my past because it's made me who I am now, but it doesn't define me. It doesn't say that is Gemma Evans, the victim. I wear everything on me like scars, and I'm happy to tell my story and happy to stand up and say this is what happened to me. But the first step is actually make sure that you acknowledge that it's happened, you take it on board, don't bury it away. If you need to cry, if you need to shout. And the second step for that is, for me personally, was forgiveness. I had to forgive my perpetrator. I didn't get any court case, I didn't get closure on my story, and for me that would be like eating a bad apple every single day and hoping that he would suffer. He's not going to suffer, whether he's dead or alive. He wouldn't suffer because he's just moved on with his life. Unfortunately, on this occasion, he's dead. But I would just be poisoned, and that poison would end up turning to anger and grief, and hurt and hate. And I realised that I needed to accept and forgive before I could move on and do anything else.
Yeah, thank you. A question from Tim now. Are perpetrators the product of an existing experience, or can they be from any background?
If you do research, it shows that they are it's possibly something that's happened in their childhood or the environment that they've actually been brought up in. But in the world that we live in today, perpetrators can actually just be born out of anything. It's the comments that are made, it's the music that's on the radio. When I can just remember, I still have local pubs in the town that I live that women are not allowed in the bar room, and all of these things give men the brain power to think that they are actually a step above a woman, and so that they can belittle a woman and they can put a woman down. So 99% of the time it is of something that they've heard. It's they've been conditioned to think like that. But there is the odd occasion that a perpetrator can just form of his own accordance.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. We've got a question from Dupsy now. What can you do if you can see all signs of abuse in a person, but the person refuses to accept he or she is a victim and says every relationship goes through this?
So I know from personal experience, my family couldn't bear to see me how I was, and they all cut ties with me, which made me feel even more alone, and it was even harder to get out of that relationship. My friends, however, was they didn't tolerate it, and they made sure that regardless, with his blessing or without it, they would make contact with me. My friends would actually ring me every Monday morning to make sure that I was still alive. And so they knew. And what I would say is, regardless of how a person is with you, they will be snappy. They will tell you that they are not a victim of domestic abuse because they haven't accepted it themselves. And all you can do is make sure that you are actually there for them. Make sure that you are there no matter what. Don't fall out with them. Don't create a barrier. Don't cut ties with them. Be there, because they need a lifeline. When they accept, they literally need a lifeline, and if they don't feel that they can reach out to you, then it might just be that they actually just decide to stay in that relationship.
Thank you. We have got so many comments from people just saying thank you for sharing your story. You're so inspirational. We've got a comment from Claire. Thank you so much for sharing your story, Gemma. I think it's so important that children are also offered support, which didn't happen in your case, to make sense of what's happened and to avoid repeating these patterns of behaviour, either as victim or as perpetrator.
Yeah, definitely. And I know I've got, like I said, I've got two young boys, one's 10 and one's 12. So they are at a very impressionable age right now. My perpetrator killed himself 7 years on February. And I speak to whenever I do anything like this, I tell both schools what I'm doing. I stood as an elected member of Parliament last year to be elected for the Women's Equality Party, to stand up for victims of abuse that had happened in Westminster. And I tell the school everything that I do. But the one thing that I would like to campaign for is that the Freedom Programme be shown and be made into a child-free version, and it be shown and rolled out to children across the land, especially girls between the age of 9 and 13.
Absolutely. We've got a question now from Daisy. Thank you, Gemma, for your story. What could be done or said to a victim by a professional to make them feel secure enough not to return to the perpetrator, or can this not be helped?
It can't be helped. The victim has to be 100% ready to leave that relationship. And what we have to bear in mind is that when a person leaves a domestically abusive relationship, they are at more risk of being killed by the perpetrator. The perpetrator feels he's losing control, and therefore he loses his power. And once he loses control, he's liable to actually do anything at all. And you just have to keep on reassuring them that it is domestic abuse. It is happening. There is people out there that will help. They just need to ask for the help, and people will help. Also, if they have a bad experience, as in my case with a local authority, they need to be reassured that just because that happened with one person, it's not going to happen across the board. There are actually some really, really good police officers and good members out there that will help. But the key thing is to just keep on reassuring them that they are in a domestically abusive relationship, and when they are ready to leave, they can leave, and they will have the support.
Thank you. Just had a comment from Amanda. Hi, I have a small but comprehensive directory of services and resources specifically for young people who have witnessed domestic violence. Feel free to email me and I'll share it with you. And her email's up on the screen for anybody that wants that. I think, honestly, these are just thank you so much, Gemma, for sharing your story. All these comments, they're just incredible. I think the other comments we've had have been similar to the questions that we've already asked. So I think we're going to wind that up now, but I just wanted to thank you so much for being part of our conference. We really, really appreciate you sharing your story with us. It was very powerful. And yeah, thank you so much, Gemma.
Thank you so much, Yvette, and thank you everybody for taking time out to come on and listen. And please, you know, if you see things on social media or you think that anything from this event will help anybody, you don't even have to be 100% sure that they are in an abusive relationship. Please just share as much as what you can, because the more awareness that we make, the more people then start to realise that they are actually victims of domestic abuse. But thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Okay, I'm now going to introduce our next speaker, Kent's Police and Crime Commissioner, Matthew Scott. Matthew was elected to this role in May 2016. Prior to this, he developed a significant amount of experience of advocacy and public relations that included Parliament and government departments. He served as a voluntary scout leader, councillor, school governor, and ran a community centre. He has a degree in public policy, government and management from the University of Birmingham. Matthew is the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners lead for mental health and custody. Matthew is also part of the APCC cross-party Brexit group. In September 2017, he joined the advisory panel for the independent review of the Mental Health Act, led by Professor Simon Wesley. And in May 2018, was asked by Sir Simon to formally lead the policing workstream of the review. Since coming into office, he's increased the number of police officers by 618, taking the overall number above that in 2010. Furthermore, he brought back the cadet scheme, which has gone from strength to strength, helping young people, some from vulnerable backgrounds, to invest their time in worthwhile activities in the community. Matthew has written for national publications and appeared on Radio 5 Live, Victoria Derbyshire, Sky News, BBC South East Today and local radio. His Police and Crime podcast launched in May 2018. I'm going to hand over to Matthew, hopefully. If you have any questions for Matthew, we may not have time to ask them in person, but please do put them in the chat and Matthew will answer them in the chat. I think he's just joining us now. We must be having some technical difficulties. And it's back to me again. Okay, see what's happening. See if I can find out what's going on. Oh, he should be joining us any minute now.
Am I there? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Welcome, Matthew. Thank you.
My profound apologies. I watched Gemma's presentation, everything was working fine, and when I clicked the on button, everything switched off. So my apologies for slight delay in joining you.
No problem at all.
Can I say thank you very much for the opportunity to meet with you all today and to be able to speak with you about this really important topic. And to echo what everyone said already about Gemma, a really inspirational speaker, a really powerful presentation, I believe, one that we can all learn so much from and also do more to work together to support other victims and survivors of domestic violence and abuse. As you've heard, my role as the Police and Crime Commissioner here in Kent is an elected one, and I do very many things. But for me, the role of Police and Crime Commissioner is to fight crime, but also it's about being a voice for victims of crime, for vulnerable people, and also the voiceless, those people who maybe feel disenfranchised, people who don't speak up or don't actually talk to the police. We need to be there making sure that there are services available for people, whether it's from the police or from charities when they need them, at the right time for them. But we're also champions for our residents, our businesses, and our community groups. And I feel that that is directly relevant to the subject of what we are talking about here today, because domestic abuse is everybody's business. And when you consider some of the presentations that you will have seen over the last 16 days, and as you will have heard today, the journey of the survivor of domestic abuse and the victim of domestic abuse overlaps so many different industries, so many different sectors, that it is important that we re-emphasize that it is everybody's business to help, support, encourage, and do the best that we can. Of course, the police have a key role to play in this, but so do the local authority, the independent domestic violence advisors, who are doing a great job here in our county. The health service and the increasing role that they play in raising awareness and dealing with victims directly in some of the projects that we run here in the county. Housing, mental health, addiction, so many different areas where you could come across someone who is a victim of these terrible and heinous crimes. We all have a responsibility to support. And just as we're talking about the future here, of course, one area where we do have a bigger role to play is in the area of public health. We've, of course, decided that we're going to take a public health approach to tackling violent crime, but we haven't decided to do that yet for domestic abuse. So let's have domestic violence reduction units, not just violence reduction units. There's a starter for 10 in terms of some of the things that we can do differently, maybe in the future. And my role as Police and Crime Commissioner is multifaceted. We have to make sure that we are holding the Chief Constable to account, that we are setting priorities, that we are being there for everybody. And in making sure that I can report back to you on some of the work that the police and that my office is doing. I went through with the force some of those key areas that I wanted to share to you. And some of these themes Gemma touched upon. And it's obviously fair to say that in the past, policing didn't perhaps provide the best service to victims that it could have done. Neither did many others. But where awareness has been raised, new campaigns have come forward, PCCs have held our forces to account. There are so many different areas where the policing response has improved. For example, one of the key areas, just by having, is more resources. We have more police officers in Kent now than ever before, but actually we're using them differently. So rather than just being a one-size-fits-all approach to every crime type, here in Kent, the Chief Constable has set up vulnerability investigation teams, which are specific teams that are well-resourced, looking at domestic abuse, sexual violence, stalking, rape and hate crime. Specialist officers with specialist skills helping to support those investigations and also those victims. The training for police officers has come on leaps and bounds over the last few years, and it's really important to emphasise how crucial that is, given the number of police officers you've got coming through training schools across policing. It's estimated that we'll have to recruit about 50,000 police officers over a 3-year period. Well, what an opportunity to make sure that the majority of policing has a better experience and better knowledge of domestic violence and abuse than training them right from the very beginning. But we continue with continuous professional development as well to make sure that new issues or emerging things like coercion and control, economic abuse and things like that are right at the forefront as officers' minds. And what's been the result of that? Increased arrest rates, increased charge rates, better safeguarding for victims. But it's not just about the policing response, it's about a response that victims want to see and how we educate and encourage them as we go. And recently Kent Police have started a new initiative which came from a local police officer, where we do now show a video to victims to highlight all of the different services which are available in the county for someone who is a victim of domestic abuse. And not just directly the individual, but also their children as well. I heard that loud and clear from the previous presentation about the support we provide for children. That is an important part of all of this as well. That will include referrals to agencies which will support children. The voice of the child is now more important within policing than it's ever has been. And schemes like Operation Encompass, where there's better data sharing between police, councils and schools, so that those young people are acknowledged to have been victims and witnesses when it comes to domestic abuse, get the support as early as they possibly can. It is so much better I think, than the situation we found ourselves in a few years ago. It's also about the statements that we make as well. I'm very proud to say that I've signed up as an ambassador for the White Ribbon campaign. Kent Police is a White Ribbon organisation, as are some of our other organisations here in the county, like Kent Kent Fire and Rescue Service, who are White Ribbon campaigners as well, making sure that we continue to raise awareness within policing, that we're standing up for victims and making sure we acknowledge the causes and the threats that are faced as a result of domestic abuse and violence. And in terms of the current situation that we've found ourselves in, I think it is a reflection of the maturity and improvement in the approach that we have to domestic abuse, that very early on, before this really crucial issue which came about, and everybody will understand why that was, around lockdowns, that domestic abuse was identified as a risk very, very early on. And many police forces and other local agencies and services tried to step up their response in anticipation, not just of the first lockdown, but when the tiered approach came in, the second lockdown, and the new tiered approach came in to best support victims. We know that some weeks during the first lockdown in particular, there was a massive increase in demand from policing. That was very interesting when you look at where that was being generated from. In 1 week, we saw a 44% increase in domestic incidents reported to police. So, of course, very high demand on policing, but making sure that they're getting there, they're attending those calls. But we saw a quite substantial increase in first-time callers, and there were a number of callers who were in contact with the police, sadly, on many occasions, who just dropped away and stopped contacting the police. There were lots of risks identified very early on that the force were able to put in place to make sure that we looked after those individuals. And I think lessons like that are things that we can take forward around repeat victims, repeat perpetrators, repeat callers into the police, so that we can judge our response better in the future. On top of this, the role that I've played in supporting victims of domestic abuse through the lockdown changed as well. As PCCs, we were really successful in securing some extra funding from central government to expand services that we provide for victims of domestic abuse and sexual violence, but also to expand into areas and other charities that we were not dealing with already. And I have to say, I would put on record my thanks to all of those charities and all of those organisations, whether they receive funding from my office or the government or not, for the way in which they stepped up to the challenge. Every service that I've spoken to has reported an increase in demand, an increase in the number of hours their volunteers are putting in, but also crucially, a really strong performance in terms of how they are dealing with those individuals and the outcomes that they are reporting back. And I'll just touch on, if I may, just a few examples of how that has manifested itself. So with the 855,000 we've secured so far, we've worked with charities like Choices and Rising Sun on their Pathways project, working with people aged 11 to 24 who have been victims or seen domestic abuse in the household. And a vast majority of those who have worked with that charity reporting an increase in their well-being, an increase in their feelings of safety and security because they'd had access to that service. In addition, we had another pilot project which started during the lockdown through Restorative Solutions, the Adolescent to Parent Violence project. And again, a real area of growth when it comes to reports coming into police in domestic abuse is between family members. It can be intergenerational, as well as adolescent to parent. Really has been a substantial increase in some of those areas. And we've been able to work with that charity to work with those young people, work with the families to try and take another approach to dealing with the violence within the household. So, of course, it's changed a lot about the way in which policing and charities have operated. I very much hope that we can all learn the lessons from the lockdown, both positive and negative, so that we can improve our response going forward into the longer term. But I think strategically, across the whole country, there are still things that we can do in order to improve the support we give to victims and witnesses across the board. The landmark domestic abuse bill has obviously been going through Parliament, which is really welcome, but that needs to be backed up, I believe, with more sustainable funding for local charities, for PCCs, for refugees, for financial support for victims, so that those things should never be a worry. We need to make sure that, yes, that whilst the legislation has changed, all of the extra support mechanisms are carrying on. There are, of course, examples. All of this extra funding which we've been provided for this year, for the lockdown, as well as some of the projects we've had in the past, needs to be sustained in the longer term. Not 1 year, not 2 year, not 3 year approaches. Maybe like the approaches which have been taken in other areas. I already mentioned, why do we not have a violence reduction unit for domestic abuse? Why do we not have a 10-year fund from the Home Office like we do with the Youth Endowment Fund? That means that we'd be able to work on a much more sustainable basis to really generate improvements in the way in which victims get support. But I think we need to refocus our approach as well. And many of you will know, most of you will know, that the violence against women and girls strategy includes men and boys. And I recently supported a campaign from the Men and Boys Coalition, actually, that would improve the response and the focus on the violence against women and girls strategy, allowing that to be a bespoke response to everything that support and guidance and law and policing that women need to see in order to survive, in order to grow, in order to see justice done. But actually, we do need a bespoke strategy for men and boys as well. 1/3 of our victims of domestic abuse will be men. We know it's still vastly underreported. And it means that if we were to have a bespoke strategy, the focus for women and girls can still be there, but actually the different challenges, the different issues which men and boys experience can be given their own focus as well. And that includes, working with brilliant local charities like DAVS, based at Tunbridge Wells, and their male support helplines, or Dads Unlimited, working with single dads and other families down in the Ashford area on mental health, on family law, on domestic abuse, actually saving lives like all of your charities are doing. So I think there are so many different things that we can do in the future to build on the momentum that we've already seen, acknowledging that we're not in a perfect situation yet, but continue to learn to continue to grow. So just to conclude my remarks, I hope you found some of the information I provided interesting, and I'm pleased to report that in the coming weeks and months I will be working with Kent Police to sign off a new domestic abuse strategy, which I hope will galvanise the support that we've already got for this area and help our response improve even further going forward. So a big thank you to the organisers of this event. These things don't come together so easily as they appear to have done, because they've done an absolutely wonderful job. But I think, Sarah and Matthew, thank you for everything you've done with my office and to make the event physically work. To all of the charities and domestic abuse providers out there in our county doing a great job of supporting vulnerable people in whatever situation they are, whether they are adults or whether they are children. And I wish you all a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak today at the conference. I think, some of the points you raised about funding and things being sustained is so important going forward. We have been all very lucky to get some funding from central government during COVID, but obviously, we'd like to see something a bit more sustainable going forward for the longer term. But thank you so much. We really appreciate you attending today. There are a few questions in the chat. I'm sure Matthew would be happy to respond in the chat, if that's okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay. Just before I go on to our final speaker, just wanted to say on behalf of CIDAS, really, a huge thank you to Fuse, who have helped us put this conference together. Without them, it just would have never happened. And they've been very patient with those of us that are technophobes, talked us through it very, very slowly and very, very carefully. So thank you for that. And also to Bryony, who has been amazing with the comms, and obviously to my colleagues in Look Ahead, Clarion and Oasis, because we've all come together, and it's been a good piece of work coming together to do this. Okay, so that just leaves me to introduce our final speaker for the conference. to give the closing remarks. I'm going to introduce you to Chris Hampson, who is the Chief Executive of Look Ahead.
Really?
Chris was appointed Look Ahead's Chief Executive in January 2015, following 15 years at the organisation, including time as both Director and Deputy Chief Executive. Chris began his career in local government and has worked for 2 inner London local authorities, housing departments. Chris has over 20 years' experience working in housing and social care, including research and campaigning on behalf of the National Housing Federation, as well as working in new business, policy and communications for 2 London-based housing associations. Chris has previously chaired the National Housing Federation's Supported Housing Providers Forum and is a member of their National Care and Support Advisory Group. He's recently been appointed as the not-for-profit representative for the NHS Confederation's Mental Health Network. Okay, over to you, Chris, to very kindly close the conference. Thank you.
Thanks, Yvette. That's a very long biog. Thanks a lot. Yes, I've been given the honour of closing this conference, which has been a wonderful 16 days. So I'm really proud to say that Look Ahead's been part of this partnership of the Kent Integrated Domestic Abuse Service of KIDAS, along with Clarion Housing Group and Oasis Domestic Abuse Victim Support, which is and with the backing of Kent County Council. I have to say, I was given some information about the reach of this conference. It's been incredibly successful, over 1,500 attendees and a great reach beyond that on the web. And from what I've just seen in the sessions I have dropped into, the engagement has been excellent from people who've been joining the sessions, and it's been a really interactive session. I think that's really what makes it. I also have seen many of the speeches, and I just want to draw on a few of them. I want to really thank Nicole Jacobs. She was the designate Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales and talked about the impending bill. I think that was really, really valuable. Also, excellent speech from Jess Phillips, the Shadow Minister for Domestic Violence and Safeguarding. And of course, we've just heard from Matthew Scott from Kent and Medway Police and Crime Commissioner. I think that was very powerful as well. And lastly, but not least, I do definitely want to mention the very personal presentations from Rosie Duffield, the MP for Canterbury, and also Gemma, who we just heard. I think it's powerful speeches like this that really make people sit up and listen and realise just how an important issue this is and how it impacts people's lives, not just the people, but and how broad it is beyond that. So thank you to all those people in a big way. I want to make a few points before we close. I think, Look Ahead, we have domestic abuse services. We work across London and the southeast and not just in Kent. But it's a pleasure working in Kent, actually, because I think partnerships like KIDAS have really shown their value, particularly through the COVID period. We've seen the pressure on family units, and we see it right across our services. And if you don't have a proper point of access in these integrated services, it can be very, very, very difficult for people to access services. So I think it's a pleasure working out here and seeing partnerships like this and conferences like this take off the way they have. And I think, what's been particularly good is we don't just, it's easy as a provider just to provide the accommodation and have the accommodation for women that need it, the traditional refuges, if you like. But if you don't have those wraparound services, such as the programs out here, such as Own My Life or the Freedom Program, the recovery toolkits, or the partnerships we're involved with in protection against stalking and cyber stalking training, and working closely with the police in the way that does happen. We're also part of the Tackling Male Domestic Abuse program out here, which was just mentioned by Matthew. And I think if you don't have all these wraparound services, people are not able to get the full support they need. And you're not just working as a domestic abuse service isolated from the rest of the community. And it's these things that bring everything together. A couple of personal observations. I, like everybody else, have loved the title, It's Everybody's Business. It's hugely important. And I'll tell you why I think that. Look Ahead is not just a provider of domestic abuse services. We've been around for about 45 years and we provide a big number of services in central London around rough sleeping. We're working more with kids leaving care, coming through the care system to 16 to 19-year-olds. We work with a lot of mental health services for young people, but also for older people, and we work in the learning disability space. And I can tell you that while we also have domestic abuse services, domestic abuse cuts across all those client groups. For young people, for many of the care leavers, they've been one of the areas of trauma has been that they have witnessed a bit domestic abuse. For many of the rough sleepers that we have in our hostels in central London, domestic abuse was a big part of their early part of their life. That's had a huge impact on them. And we see domestic abuse in our mental health, people who it sits behind some of the mental health issues and challenges that people face, and our learning disability schemes. And I can tell you, if Look Ahead were a provider of older people schemes, we would see probably domestic abuse in that space as well. It is everywhere, and its reach is everywhere, and we need to understand that. And providing hostels and accommodation is great, but that is only the very sharp end of it. I wanted to say a couple of final words about the staff that work in domestic abuse. And I'm always knocked out a little bit when I go to schemes and meet them. And I think particularly the women I meet that work within the domestic abuse are so committed to the cause and take huge leadership in this space. And I think what we do know about domestic abuse is that it's complex. And to understand the complexities, you have to have amazing insight. You have to have emotional intelligence, and you have to have sensitivity, and you have to put all these things together for you to address these problems. And for many of the issues that are often raised, it's led by women in the sector, and it's led by women who have either experienced domestic violence or hugely committed to it and making a lot of noise. And I think, the two women we heard, the politicians with Rosie and Jess, I think illustrates that. But it is everybody's business. And for me, as a man and a father of two young boys, I think we need to make sure that the discussions are happening everywhere. And I'm the father of two teenage boys, and quite often on Saturday morning you'll find me in Hackney Marshes watching football, or in upper northeast London, another part, up in Barking and Dagenham watching the other boy. And I'm on the sideline with 20, 30 men from all different backgrounds talking about all sorts of different things. But, we know we've really had a wider reach when we're getting men on the side of football challenging other men about things they're saying, knowing that things are not acceptable, and certain language. And I think, until we get men talking about this as well, we really know and men taking leadership where they can as well, we'll know we're making real inroads, and we really are tackling this as an issue. And I also think it's about really, and Matthew talked about this, but other speakers have talked about this, it's about really early interventions, not just dealing with the sharp end. And as being a father of two young boys as well, it's about looking at what's going on social media. What are boys saying about girls? Are we challenging that as parents? Are we teaching them to teach young women and women with respect? And how much are we making those early interventions? And we all have a role to play. And I think Jess Phillips summed it up in her quote when she said, we need to make DA, domestic abuse, unacceptable. And that's what we've got to do. And she also posed another really important statistic that's sort of rung very true with me, that 60% of women that front up for help for domestic violence are turned away. And you imagine if we compare that to physical health problems, and I think diabetes was the example she used, that 60% that fronted up with a problem around diabetes were turned away. We just can't have that, and that's why we have to make we have to make noise about this. But we have to be realistic. We're coming out of the COVID pandemic. The government spent something like, I don't know how many hundreds of billions of pounds of public money. There's going to be a scramble for public funds, so we must make sure that DA is not at the back of the queue. And that's why I think the last 16 days have been so important, that we make the noise that we need to make. We're out there and we're in line to get the funding that this issue deserves, that it should get. Closing. So this is the final. I am closing it down now. Just practicalities. If you want to get any more access about training or any of the service, find out about more of the service or anything around domestic abuse, contact any of the KIDAS partners. I'm about to give you the website, but I'm sure that will be made available by the organisers, but it's www.domesticabuseservices.org.uk. And just finally, I think, what keeps us going, even when it's, is the feedback we get from the people that use our services. And time again, I hear from our support workers about this basically someone saying to me how they, for the first time in many years, feel safe in their own home, or that the services that we provide or or around us have been an actual lifesaver for them. You know, when you hear those sorts of things, it's a huge spur to continue to work in this space. So thank you all. I'm officially closing the conference, and a big thank you again to all the KIDAS, all the people involved in the conference, and to Kent County Council for making this happen as well. So take care and stay safe. Thank you, everybody.